Vamos a empezar formalmente ahora la presentación. Bien. Bueno, vamos a empezar formalmente ahora la... Bien, muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos nuevamente a un conversatorio más del ciclo de... Bien, muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos nuevamente a un conversatorio más del ciclo de... Bien, muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos nuevamente a un conversatorio más del ciclo de... Muy buenos días a todos. Un conversatorio más del ciclo. Muy buenos días. Ahora sí. Entonces, nuevamente bienvenido, Damian. Es un gusto tenerte en la oficina de la OIT, en este nuevo ciclo de conversatorios. Entonces, esa es la primera vez que estamos haciendo en forma híbrida el ciclo. Entonces, a todos los colegas que nos están escuchando, que nos está escuchando por la plataforma Zoom y por también la plataforma de YouTube, les pido disculpas si hay alguna descoordinación en la conexión, pero la idea es invitarte para lo que hemos titulado en este conversatorio una charla sobre negociación colectiva, desempeño económico y crecimiento inclusivo. Damian también fue director del Departamento de Investigaciones de OIT por un tiempo. Tuvimos la oportunidad de trabajar conjuntamente unos pocos años y ahora de regreso a la academia vamos a beneficiarnos también de la experiencia acumulada y también lo que está escribiendo, que es muy relevante para América Latina, pocos años, que se está rediscutiendo y redefiniendo las relaciones laborales y el futuro de las instituciones de trabajo. Entonces, Damian, bienvenido y te doy la palabra para que puedas hacer una presentación. Luego vamos a tomar algunas preguntas para la transmisión por YouTube y los que están presentes. Luego nos vamos a quedar conversando. Puedas hacer una presentación, invitado. Vamos a tomar algunas preguntas para la transmisión por YouTube y los que están presentes. Adelante, Damian. Vamos a quedar conversando. Puedas hacer una presentación.
Muchísimas gracias. Es un gran placer estar aquí.
Adelante.
Gracias por la invitación, Fabio. Muchísimas gracias. Sí, nos conocimos cuando estuve en la OIT. Ahora volví a la academia y estoy muy interesado todavía en todos los temas de la OIT. Ahora volví, puedo hablar castellano. El problema que tengo es que las palabras técnicas no tengo mucha experiencia. Entonces volví a hablar inglés. El problema que tengo es que no le molesta mucho. Mi castellano es bueno para charlar. Entonces 10 minutos. Después a inglés. No puedo hacer chistes tampoco en castellano. Mi castellano es bueno para charlar. Bueno, entonces, so let me start in English. That's okay. No puedo hacer chistes tampoco. So Fabio said that here in Chile, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the role of collective bargaining in fostering a new type of economic growth and productivity growth. And this is very close to my heart. This topic is something I've thought about the last few years and been trying to write things about. So I'm going to talk to this topic. And I think it's very pertinent topic, not only in Chile, but I think the global context at the moment is one of rising inequality and stagnant incomes and a slowing of productivity growth. So, many policymakers around the world are looking for this secret ingredient to foster economic growth in a way that conforms more with the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. And I think collective bargaining as a mechanism for social dialogue is crucial in this respect. So I want to think about some of the aspects involved. So what I want to do in this talk for half an hour or so, I know it stopped working. Here we go. No? See, it works in the check, but now it's not working. Hang on. Well, maybe somebody can do it from the room. If you can move to the next slide. Apologies, it's not working anymore. So what I want to do is think about this relationship between collective bargaining and economic growth. There's been a lot of attention on the particular form of collective bargaining, and less attention, I think, on the particular form of economic growth. And so I think it's important to look at both sides of this equation. The whole debate now is what type of economic growth we need to be fostering in countries and around the world. And these are questions that probably have a different characteristic between the global north and global south. But these, of course, this question about the type of economic growth is at the heart of the 2030 agenda, but it's not really filtered through still into many of the main models, regressions on how we think about productivity. So I want to say something about that. I want to then just collect together some of the theory and international evidence about what we know today in terms of the relationship between collective bargaining and productivity. And I'll extend that also to include pay equity, because that's a key component of inclusive growth. And then because I think if we want to achieve, generate and sustain inclusive growth, we need to think very carefully about pay equity, and collective bargaining is one of the main mechanisms here to drive pay equity, but it has to work in concert with minimum wage policy. And there are various dilemmas here, I think, which can be illustrated through detailed country cases. I don't think we get so far with some of the sort of multivariate regressions, because I think we lose some of the country institutions, which are interesting. But nevertheless, some countries have more to do with other countries. I'm only just going to illustrate the UK and Germany. But as Fabio and I were saying earlier, the UK and Chile do seem to be converging in many of the institutional characteristics. And those are minimum wage policy and collective bargaining are particularly convergent here, I think. It's an interesting comparative case to be done. And I'll end with just one slide on some policy issues, but I'm very interested today to learn more from the Chilean and Latin American perspective. I'm spending these 2 months in Buenos Aires, where I'm working on some of the Argentinian labor relations issues. So I'm open, but I have really no expertise on Chile and Argentina. So the evidence I'm bringing is international and also mainly European. Now it's working. So if we think about this intellectual debate about the role of collective bargaining in promoting growth, I think if we go back, we can see that the surrounding economic and political context and is one that shaped the sort of intellectual agenda of the day. Back in the 70s and 80s, where there were more perhaps social pacts, a stronger role of trade unions working in concert with other social partners, with the employers. A lot of what we learned about collective bargaining was shaped by ideas about corporatism. And these were historical, generally country-specific accounts. The response from the economists from the sort of 80s and 90s was this neoliberal free market agenda, framed around neoclassical economics, labor supply, labor demand models, with this very important study from the OECD in 1994, which promoted a lot of deregulation, liberalization, and framed also around a model called the Calm-Force-Driftel hypothesis, which is still being taught in economics classes. And I want to say a few more words about that, because I think it's very interesting as a kind of a Swedish-British collaborative project. It's an interesting model. The response to that was people said, well, but you can't have one size fits all in a very complex global economy with different types of capitalisms. So the varieties of capitalism was sort of born, although there were many precursors to this, of course, not least through the old studies of corporatism. But the Holden-Sosky study was the one that really took the attention. But the neoclassical economic agenda for deregulation, decentralization, collective bargaining, if not wiping out collective bargaining, is still alive and well. People called it, after the financial crisis, they referred to it as the curious non-death of neoclassical economics. It's alive and well, and I think is still the bedrock behind many policymakers' sort of fantasies. And I often find it curious that when you talk to policymakers who might be in their 50s, 60s, and they've had one or two modules of economics, some of these neoclassical economics ideas get stuck because they sort of appeal to our intuition. They're quite simple, quite straightforward. The maths behind them is very sophisticated, but the idea, economists have a very good way of selling relatively straightforward, intuitive ideas. But they can be quite risky for policymakers. I think where we are now is a sort of bifurcation of ideas. Those still hanging on to these ideas of flexible labor markets, and others who are trying to frame new ideas of growth, which is more in keeping with the SDG agenda. And I think from what I've read, the little I've read about the Chilean policy discourse at the moment, I think it's more on this side, right, with the new productivity agenda and others. So when we think about the model of collective bargaining, we know there's various features, characteristics, whether that's high-low organizational membership, what's often framed now as around associational power resources. The level is very important. So that's going to thread through what I say during the talk. Whether or not government steps in and says, well, this regional collective agreement might be useful, and let's extend it to other regions in the country. And also the degree of coordination. That can be very important, not only between sectors, say between manufacturing services, public, private, but also between levels, between the enterprise, the sector, and even the nation. But on the other side, we can also frame different kinds of economic growth. I would say that GDP growth, productivity growth are key indicators for both types of growth, whether it's conventional or inclusive. But both types of growth, we have to recognize, have other indicators that frame and complement or conflict with those two headline targets of GDP and productivity. So conventional growth is also typically complemented by job growth, often at all costs. Fast market response is absolutely central. Getting obstacles out of the way so that businesses and government can make a fast market response. Cost competitiveness, and that's typically labor cost competitiveness, and also increasingly around the world, shareholder returns, which sort of goes together with the short-termism. So they're indicators which I think are also often perhaps not talked about enough, but they're part of a conventional growth strategy. The inclusive growth strategy also has a set of complementary and perhaps slightly conflicting indicators. And they're the following: their income equality, I should say, formalization, environmental sustainability, long-term investment rather than short-term, and that's often with different stakeholders, not only shareholders, and this new notion that everybody's talking about, resilience, which we've learned so much about through the pandemic. I did think it was interesting, the speech of the Secretary General to the General Assembly yesterday. I thought it was really striking that he denounced short-termism, both in politics and in business. I thought that was very, very interesting and useful for this strategizing around how to develop policies, especially labor policies, for inclusive growth. Probably going too slow. I just want to say with this that if one were to develop models for thinking about how social dialogue mechanisms there on the left could feed through to macro performance and micro performance, these are some of the kinds of issues that arise in thinking through those effects. And I think we have to be fairly honest in saying that there'll be both positives and negatives. The red there are the negatives for a conventional growth agenda, and the black are the positives, because even in a conventional growth agenda, one has to recognize there might be positives. But many studies that only focus on conventional growth indicators, I think, are more likely to find negatives with social dialogue than positives, because of the way the equation is framed, because they're framing it around conventional growth. So social dialogue isn't able to instrumentalize all the wonderful things it can do, because many of the indicators aren't even considered. So on the macro level, sure, social dialogue is going to slow market adjustment. We know that talking takes time. And so there's going to be a series of deliberative decision-making, sharing of information and building of trust. And that can slow things down. It can also impede downward wage flexibility. I mean, what trade union is going to agree to downward real wage flexibility? Although, of course, now it's happening all the time because you can never get the wage rises to keep up with inflation. But by slowing wage flexibility downwards, that's often seen as a negative in a conventional growth framework because, for example, in an economic crisis, you need to help tradable sectors, and often that means reducing labor costs. So working with trade unions isn't seen as the best way to go. So again, it's the way the equation is framed. But nevertheless, even in conventional growth, macro can also give positives, and stabilizing production in crisis has been a recognized plus, I think, through COVID-19. At the micro level, again, it constrains management prerogative. So managers will want to hire temporary contracts, casuals, 0 hours contracts, which we have 1 million people or more working on 0 hours in Britain. They're impeded where there's strong and effective social dialogue. So again, that's a negative in a conventional growth framework. It can also impede high executive pay and stock buybacks. There's a big debate about stock buybacks, the pluses and minuses of that. And that's seen as a negative. But then again, it can still build trust, and it can reduce management non-compliance, because even a macroeconomic textbook assumes rule takers. It doesn't assume rule breakers. So having more compliance is a good thing in conventional growth. The opposite is an inclusive growth, which, as I've said earlier, has a different range of indicators. So you've got a different test base. And here we find that social dialogue is almost always a positive. I'm hypothesizing and also sort of bringing in literature in the associated paper. A key negative that keeps coming out, especially among the political scientists, is that there's a risk of labor market dualism. That too often there are incentives for trade unions and employers to make a pact that protects their own, regardless of what's happening outside. It's debated, but anyway, it is shown for certain periods in certain countries. The pluses are many. You can work strongly through social dialogue to design active labor market policy, for long-term innovation, industrial policy, and long-term investments in skill and training, where you need to have a negotiation that sorts out this balance between general and firm-specific skills. High wage equality is an obvious one, and that's where we see this intersection with minimum wage policy, which I'll talk about. Supporting green and digital transitions is another thing that's happening a lot through tripartism, and underpinning resilience in crisis, as we've seen with all the different short work schemes that arose through the COVID. At the micro level also, you can have technical change that isn't only cost reducing and controlling, as we see in many digital platform work. You can also have a more human-oriented one, which thinks about knowledge flows in an organization. Lower job turnover that comes with more commitment and more worker voice. Reduce precarious work because you don't have so much casual work. You protect standard contracts. It may, of course, slow change management processes, and maybe that's a bad thing. But on the other hand, you have more consensus and sustained situations and less conflict. So that's the way one could frame, a set of economic and empirical projects like that. But that hasn't been done yet, right? So that's a sort of a general set of hypotheses. Most of the evidence that we have is framed around conventional growth with this sort of add-on of thinking about pay equity. So that's what I'm going to just quickly run through now. But I just, for the purpose of just showing just how powerful this model is, I just wanted to share this famous or infamous Calmfors, who was Swedish, Triffle, who I think was British, sort of UK American relationship. And this is their famous curve, which I think is still stuck in the heads of many, many, many policymakers, not least in Britain. So if you've got the textbook market competition, fine, no unemployment or very low. And if you've got national bargaining, where everybody's talking and sharing information and it's all a wonderful universe, is also fine. And I think it's no accident that one's Sweden and one's Britain or US. So those two authors are fine. They've sorted out their sort of conflicts about which country is the best. Everybody else is in the middle, where it's not fine, where unemployment is very high. right? So everybody outside of their Calm-Force Driftle universe is worried. So this was the early 90s, and there's different curves. And if you have monopoly competition, it's not so good to have market. And if you have trade, it's not so good to be national bargaining. But basically, that's the curve. And so many policymakers basically used this in the 90s to deregulate and decentralize. And we saw during the 2000s many, dozens and dozens of studies, not least the OECD recanting everything they said in 1994, and their famous study in 2004 saying we were wrong. I mean, they say 100 times in that report, we were wrong, we were wrong, we were wrong. The world is actually more complicated. But in terms of theory, what we learned from reading those different studies during the sort of last 20 years, I think we should, these are things to keep in mind. That one is that employers and unions aren't always and don't have to be short-term, self-seeking economic actors. I think the work of Sam Bowles is really interesting on this. He's always talking about individuals. But in my mind, when he says, the individual can be altruistic and can be long-term and can be cooperative, for me, that's the firm and the trade union and even the government, right? So we have to think that there's a sort of a more optimistic possible scenario for cooperative economic behavior. And I think there is. So that's one thing. The other is that coordination turns out to be more important than the level. We often get obsessed about fixing the level of bargaining, but it's the coordination that really matters. You could have really, really good sort of coordination across all your firms with enterprise bargaining, or coordination between levels. So we shouldn't get too fixated on just the level. So the other is to keep in mind that coordination is horizontal between sectors and vertical, sort of nation, sector, and firm. And of course, this is even more important when we think about global value chains, where things get very interesting, and domestic value chains. So there's multiple forms of multi-level intersectoral coordination. It's very difficult often to say this country's predominant form of bargaining is, which so many studies still do, right? The Eurofound is famous for doing this. The predominant form of bargaining is when most countries is much more of a hybrid patchwork. I think that's worth keeping in mind. The other is that the performance effects are very difficult to separate out from other wage fixing effects. And there's a whole array of variables we could put in here. And I know that econometrics allows a certain level of sophistication here, but we need to think very carefully about interaction effects going in different directions. The other is how to relate to economy-wide performance when you've got a sort of a hybrid patchwork economy, not least formal, informal, union, non-union, collective bargaining, non-collective bargaining. So how do you separate out those and work out those macro effects? That's quite difficult, I think. And relatedly, how to theorize these mediating variables. We know now that equality and growth are intimately related. It's not a trade-off. There's some very interesting positive intersections there that can work through. So how do you then bring in collective bargaining? Because we also know collective bargaining and wage equality are, strongly positively related. And then the other issue, one of formalization. How do we build these mediating variables into our models? Oh, that's a shame, isn't it? Look. Anyway, you don't want to read that anyway. It's too many things. Just to say that I did summarize these studies, and most of them, with the exceptions of Boeri's work, he's always cited, but he's on his own. And Calm-Force and Driftle, the old stuff. I didn't include the OECD 94 because, as I say, they recanted, so it wouldn't be fair. But all the others say there isn't a negative relationship between collective bargaining and economic growth, right? They rule it out. So there's just those two studies. So, but as I say, Boeri gets a lot of attention. It's because he's the only one. The Brackman and Brandl, I think, is the best recent econometric study looking at different types of collective bargaining and productivity growth. And again, we don't have to go into this too much detail, but he's sort of using all the recent and very nice and nuanced variables, constructed all these different variables for different types of bargaining with levels and coordination, and showed that firm level, especially if it's not coordinated firm level stuff is the worst. That's negative. But even if you have company bargaining, it doesn't give you great productivity growth. So the good ones, the best ones, are those with different types of governed he uses the word governed instead of coordinated. I don't know why. But governed company and sector, so coordinated multi-level company sector, that's strong. Governed company, it says ... but believe me, that's company national. That's positive. And also governed sector national. So they're always governed and they're always multi-level, right? That's what comes out of his regression study, or theirs, I should say. This should say that Calmfors, at least, not Driffel as far as I know, but Calmfors, he went to chair then the National Economic Council of Sweden, and he wanted to say to people, look, be careful what you do with our theory, because we like working with theory because we're theoreticians. But really, the world of policy is another thing altogether. Experience suggests that the gap between economic theorizing in this field and the more day-to-day considerations of the practitioners is huge. So, be careful sort of so he obviously wasn't that happy. Well, he wasn't happy with what the OECD said in '94 with his model. So he's got papers about this. The microstudies has been reviewed in a meta-analysis by Richard Freeman and others. And again, it's a similar set of findings that they reject the conventional growth model and find that it's a more nuanced picture, with the exception of the UK, unfortunately, which is problematic. We know the relationship with low-paid work. I think this is a well-known association, at least on average, right? Look at the negative line there that shows that low-pay incidence is lower with higher rates of collective bargaining coverage. The problem with this graph, of course, is that you could, look at all those verticals. So Chile comes out really well. It's high minimum wage, right? And it's formal economy. It's not all the economy. But you can draw verticals. Well, how do we explain the difference between Chile and, USA? Pretty similar on collective bargaining, a little bit higher, but massively different. So it's not a collective bargaining effect there. It's a minimum wage effect, and probably other things too. And similarly, look at Uruguay on the right compared to Sweden. Similarly high collective bargaining coverage, but very different on low pay. So we shouldn't pretend that collective bargaining can do everything either. But it is positive in reducing inequality, and it's also positive overall in reducing interdecile wage equality. So there's other, that's more problematic for Chile. It's above the average there. So if I just may say just 5 more minutes on this relationship with minimum wage policy, because I think if we want to talk about collective bargaining as a key institutional component for inclusive growth, we have to think more about the intersection with minimum wage policy. Because that's where we tackle the issue with low wages. So there are various questions here. I think there is a kind of a tripartite international consensus about minimum wages. They play a key role. There isn't a consensus about the most suitable minimum wage fixing process. Should it be technocratic, negotiated? Should it be by government decree? And we see all different types there. And among unions and employers, there isn't a consensus about how best to influence minimum wages. Should they or shouldn't they? And increasingly important, how should minimum wage policy interact with their collective bargaining strategy? And that's where we see lots of tensions, I think, in countries like Chile and the UK. So I'll just go through fairly briefly, but you can think of minimum wage fixing on this triangle with more technocratic, formulaic approaches, with more government assertion, or with strong power and influences coming from the sphere of collective bargaining into the minimum wage frame. So if I just say a few words about the UK, UK's moved into a more sort of political realm with its UK policy recently, and away from what was kind of a technocratic social dialogue function. It's got weak collective bargaining, as you know, so there was relatively little influence there between collective bargaining and wage policy. But since 2016, we've had this really ambitious target of raising the minimum wage to first 60% of median wage, and then 2/3 of median earnings. Median earnings for all employees, not for full-time, and that's a big difference because the OECD does the low pay target for full-time, which I think is better. But we do the all employee earnings because it's lower, because we have about 25% people in part-time work and they're paid poorly. So it was seen a little bit by Willie Brown and other academics as a substitution for social dialogue. But what it has done is we've had the longest period now of significant minimum wage rises. So I haven't looked recently, but I think we probably caught up with Chile in terms of the proportion of median earnings. And what's significant in the current high inflation context, well, high inflation, 10, 11%, not Argentinian style high inflation, the minimum wage has more or less kept track, but not because it wanted to keep track with inflation, because it was meeting this target of 2/3 of median wage. So it was sort of accidental, but it's worked. Nevertheless, it's got problems. There isn't an instrument to adapt to high inflation. So if we keep having high inflation after the target year of 24, we haven't got a mechanism to keep up with inflation, unlike France, say, which meets every quarter, and they have been updating their minimum wage every quarter with inflation. I also think the minimum wage policy, and maybe this is a discussion for here, also for Chile, I think it's overstretched. I think policy makers in Britain expect the minimum wage to do a lot more than it ought to do, or that it's capable of doing. So rather than using the minimum wage as a floor to prevent exploitation, they're using the minimum wage now to set wages for all kinds of different jobs, care work, retail work, and the list of jobs keeps expanding. So we have more and more and more jobs defined as minimum wage jobs, which I think is wrong. I don't think that meets norms of fairness, where people want a fair reward for their skills, their experience, and so on. There are also limited ripple effects of a minimum wage increase because we don't have collective bargaining in most low-wage sectors. In 90% of low-wage sectors, there's no collective bargaining. It also has nothing to do with the weekly cost of living. So we've reduced low hourly pay, as you see there on the left, quite a fantastic reduction in low hourly pay. Below, it used to be around 1 in 4 people, it's now 1 in 7. But low weekly pay has not changed, right? Because more people are on casual jobs, irregular hours, not getting enough hours, and so on. So a last couple of words with Germany, quite a different politics of minimum wage. And here it was quite technocratic when they introduced the minimum wage in 2016. And it's moved into this area between collective bargaining and state politics, as I want to explain now. Germany's been an interesting case because of this recent introduction of minimum wage. Sorry, in 2015, I said 16. And this took a long time, really, because we already knew in the early 2000s that there were problems with low pay, right? Not least, with the challenge of unification, but more problems as well with some shift in collective bargaining structures as well, which affected most people in low-paid work. So anyway, then a new consensus around the new minimum wage in 2015, initially quite low. I think that's recognized now. But what's interesting about the minimum wage law in Germany is that it was done as an act to strengthen collective bargaining, at least on paper. That was the intention. Some people like Thorsten Schulten are watching the evidence as to whether there's been a strengthening, and he's still saying he's not seeing the evidence. But nevertheless, it's there on paper, right, to build on. I think what's been interesting recently is the way in which strong trade union campaigns and gains have fed through into the minimum wage discourse. So there was a famous campaign by trade unions working with fast food workers to bargain, this was 4 or 5 years ago, to bargain for €12 hourly wage, significantly above the then minimum wage. And they got a 4-year deal to get up to €12. And this, by the way, because of the wage grid, this was just the entry wage. So €12 entry wage, and then there were lots of other wage differentials above that. And you'll see from this graph, this was significantly above the minimum wage. And it expected to get up to €12 by 2014. But then some people say that this change of norms around what is a fair wage for low-paid workers had an effect on the minimum wage policy making, and the government, through its coalition, enacted a new €12 minimum wage for everybody. So maybe this was a populist move, maybe it was a way of restoring their political strength. But nevertheless, you can't deny, I don't think, the confluence of union power resources and this important success, not only there were other sectors too where they were successful, and this shift in minimum wage. So it's an interesting example of a sort of a conflation between collective bargaining, union strategies, and minimum wage policy. Of course, it raises lots of questions about what's going to happen, and can the collective agreements be sufficiently dynamic to keep up with minimum wage rises? So it's quite challenging. So I'll end with this slide on policy issues, and welcome questions, and also I have questions of my own, like Gillian case. So on theory, I do think we need to chase inclusive growth and be absolutely insistent that when we're reading econometrics work and regression models, and ask, well, what other indicators are in there? What other variables are they interested in? And what is complementing GDP growth and productivity growth? Because we need to know the shape and the color and the flavor of GDP growth from now on. That's very important, I think. So the evidence is allowing for more sophisticated modeling and thinking about mediating variables, instrument variables, interacting variables. But again, we need to be mindful of the character of wage bargaining that we're thinking about, and ensuring we're capturing different aspects. And I think the work of Bernd Brandl is useful in this regard. I think we have to admit that country systems around the world are hybrids. They're never going to be the archetype that's presented in some theoretical case. So again, we have to think carefully about this so that we're not superimposing a type on a particular country. And of course, the ILO is always very good at this. Whenever we say something about the ILO, we always have the adjoiner, but then, subject to specific conditions with, and I think that's very important. It's what distinguishes, in my mind, the ILO approach to, the World Bank approach, which is a little bit more universalistic, I think, in some of its policy approaches, not all, but in some. Inclusive growth, I think, if we're thinking about collective bargaining, it has to look at the interaction with minimum wage policy, because it's vital for pay equity. And for many countries that don't have even a base of collective bargaining to work with, they only work with minimum wage policy. And in fact, countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Vietnam now has more collective bargaining, but Bangladesh and Pakistan, they have the work we did there on minimum wages suggests that was almost a substitution for collective bargaining in some sense. You can't really, anyway, that's a different point. So we have to think about this. And I would end by just saying that there's only two instruments, collective bargaining and minimum wage policy, and of course, with a view to broadening and deepening solidarity in labour markets in a particular country, the wider policy mix is also fundamental. So thinking about extending labour rights and enhancing labour rights and social protection, formalisation, which goes hand in hand with this extension enhancing, improving a living wage and thinking about whether minimum wage is offering a living wage, and thinking about this new idea of associational power resources and how both on employer side and trade union side, one can provide the resources that are necessary for effective social dialogue. So with that, I'll end. Thank you. I welcome questions. Thanks.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Damien. Gracias a todos y todos por la tolerancia respecto al inicio, que teníamos un poco de eco, y también olvidé advertir a los colegas, aunque en la invitación habíamos comentado que ibas a hacer la presentación en inglés, porque tenemos un tiempo limitado y es más fácil poder cumplir con el tiempo, y ahora el diálogo puede ser híbrido también, en términos de la conversación. Entonces vamos a tomar 2 o 3 preguntas, comentarios. Están los colegas que están conectados en la plataforma Zoom, después están los colegas acá en la sala. Entonces voy a ver Roxana, que estaba conectada, no sé si sigue conectada, tiene que salir porque vamos a tener también la presentación del programa laboral hoy. Entonces voy a comenzar con Roxana para darle la posibilidad de que haga una pregunta, comente, y luego tomamos otras preguntas. Entonces, Roxana, adelante.
Hola, buen día. ¿Me escuchan bien?
Me escuchamos.
¿Se escucha? Ok. Bueno, buen día a todos y a todas. Hola, Demian. Muchas gracias por por tu presentación muy interesante y creo que aborda muchas temáticas. Buen día a todos y a todas. Hola, Demian. Muchas gracias por tu presentación. Yo me estoy escuchando con eco, pero no sé.
Seguimos.
Sí.
Adelante, Roxana, a ver, intentemos.
Dale. A ver, no, una primera pregunta, por lo menos en esta primera ronda, de un tema particular que Demian mencionó, específico, que tiene que ver con la rotación ocupacional y el efecto que tendrían las negociaciones colectivas sobre la rotación, sobre la movilidad y en particular la vinculación entre la rotación y la productividad laboral. Para América Latina sabemos que, bueno, América Latina es un continente con muy elevada rotación laboral o inestabilidad ocupacional, aún para el mundo formal, y además es una región con baja productividad sistémica. Entonces, por un lado están las discusiones que cada tanto vuelven y sobre todo en contextos de crisis, en donde se argumenta que una mayor flexibilidad permitiría aumentos de productividad, pero justamente como mencionabas, Demian, también hay una amplia literatura que muestra que las relaciones laborales largas y la menor rotación contribuyen positivamente a los aumentos de productividad. Mi pregunta es, en esta relación entre rotación y productividad, y quizás un poco mirando el continente aquí, ¿qué rol tendrían las negociaciones colectivas? O sea, en particular, ¿cómo interactúan las negociaciones o qué es lo que uno podría esperar de las negociaciones colectivas a diferente nivel en esta vinculación que uno puede esperar? De un lado se argumenta positivamente, del otro lado negativamente sobre rotación laboral y productividad. Y el otro punto que mencionabas es cómo interactúa efectivamente el salario mínimo con la negociación colectiva. Estamos viviendo, lo mencionabas también, un periodo para la región particularmente complejo por la aceleración inflacionaria, en donde en buena parte de la región el salario mínimo está cayendo, pero no necesariamente eso efectivamente se observa respecto de las negociaciones colectivas y los salarios negociados colectivamente. Entonces, efectivamente, ahí puede haber una separación que se esté aumentando en este contexto inflacionario. Entonces, efectivamente, digamos, cómo uno puede entender o cómo puede manejar esta situación para efectivamente evitar mayores caídas, entendiendo siempre que por supuesto hay una variable relevante en estas discusiones en la región que tiene que ver con la informalidad laboral, ¿no? Entonces, hoy estamos viviendo un periodo que nuevamente se acelera el crecimiento de la informalidad laboral a la vez que los salarios mínimos están cayendo. Entonces, estas discusiones que hemos tenido durante mucho tiempo respecto de los impactos del salario mínimo en la formalidad o en los procesos de formalización o informalización, hoy no necesariamente se están observando como lo estábamos observando en el pasado. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Bien, muchas gracias, Roxana. Cuando Roxana refiere a caída del salario mínimo, el salario mínimo real, ¿no? En términos nominales todavía digamos, claro, se mantiene. Bien. Claro. Gerhard, acá en la sala, adelante.
Sí, yo creo que sí. Sí, bueno, muchas gracias. Yo creo que hay algunos temas que están como entre líneas y claro, no podías desarrollar todo, pero lo que me interesó mucho fue esto de qué hace un aumento de salario mínimo a la negociación colectiva. Y bueno, con Alemania vamos a tener eso, los economistas deben estar felices porque uno tiene un caso donde, bueno, antes no había y ahora hay, o sea, tienes un caso de estudio bastante interesante, pero vemos también en otros países en la región que donde el salario mínimo es relativamente alto, a veces la negociación colectiva es bastante pobre. Estoy pensando para Paraguay, y cuando negocian colectivamente lo hacen poco, y cuando lo hacen el contenido es muy, muy pobre de los convenios porque no hay nada más que negociar mucho, por lo menos no en el sector privado. Entonces, como lo pusiste como uno de los puntos de qué hace uno al otro, pero no lo desarrollaste si tienes alguna hipótesis, que, por ejemplo, qué podría pasar en un país desarrollado como Alemania, y qué podría pasar en los países como latinoamericanos de otras regiones cuando el salario mínimo se hace más fuerte.
Bien, muchas gracias, Gerhard. Sergio.
Muchas gracias, Demian, por la exposición. Apenas un poco agregando elementos a lo que acaba de manifestar Gerhard. Es muy común en otras partes de la región americana ver que la negociación colectiva, como lo dijo él, es insípida, pero a veces la fijación de un salario mínimo por decreto hace con que la masa de los trabajadores ganen el salario mínimo. Y en muchas ocasiones, como el mercado de trabajo es muy informal, a veces el salario mínimo es lo máximo que pueden alcanzar. Muchos reciben por debajo del salario mínimo, lo que hace con que constituya una meta. Y en ese caso quería oír tu comentario, cómo hacer que la negociación colectiva se vuelva una costumbre, una tradición y se mire con otros ojos, que no sean los de la fijación de un salario mínimo por decreto. Gracias.
Bien. Tengo Jaime, Juan José y Sebastián. Si te parece, tomamos esas tres preguntas. Porque se pueden presentar también,
Sí.
Si no tuvieron oportunidad cuando iniciamos.
Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Jaime y trabajo en temas de empresas, derechos humanos y derechos fundamentales del trabajo. Y justo lo que me interesa y observé tiene que ver con la influencia de las empresas, principalmente las multinacionales y las cadenas globales, y el impacto que tienen estas en las políticas salariales y el rol que pueden jugar también los acuerdos marcos globales, ¿no? Entonces no me queda muy claro en esta configuración tecnocrática, política, dónde posicionamos el rol y el impacto que puede generar o la influencia que puede generar la empresa.
Bien, muchas gracias, Jaime. Juan José.
Sí, bueno, muchísimas gracias por la exposición y tal vez ya te han pedido que profundices mucho en diferentes temas, pero hiciste un comentario sobre la fortaleza de las organizaciones sindicales de cara al impulso y a la protección sobre, entre otras cosas, los temas salariales y el salario mínimo. Posiblemente no sea, tal vez en Argentina es mucho más evidente con todas las discusiones que hay paritarias y están reconsiderando los temas salariales constantemente, pero no sea la situación en casi la gran parte del Cono Sur, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, tal vez en Uruguay también hay una discusión que avanza en ese contexto, pero ciertamente no es la constante en la región. ¿Tú considerarías que ha sido exitoso la fortaleza que han tenido por lo menos los TUC en Inglaterra, en el Reino Unido, en esa acumulación de fuerza a lo largo de los años, en esa discusión y sentarse en esa mesa? Porque esa es otra cosa que sucede de vez en cuando, ¿eh? Las organizaciones sindicales no tienen el suficiente espacio para sentarse en la mesa y discutir temas de salario mínimo. Entonces, un comentario con respecto a esa comparativa con sindicatos de muy larga data que tienen estas discusiones y sindicatos que todavía luchan por participar en estas condiciones mínimas de relaciones laborales.
Muy bien. Sebastián.
Muchas gracias, Demian, por tu presentación. Sebastián Ugarte, de la Universidad de Chile, por si acaso. Bueno, uno de tus comentarios era que a través del diálogo social era una buena manera de promover el crecimiento inclusivo. Y bueno, y considerando ese motor, y por otro lado, nuestra realidad, no sé, sindical, de relaciones laborales, nosotros tenemos aproximadamente un 20% de tasa de sindicalización. Sin embargo, solo creo que el 6% de las empresas aproximadamente están sindicalizadas, ¿ya? Casi 0% de las pequeñas y micro, 3% de las medianas y el resto, no sé, de las grandes empresas. Entonces, mi pregunta es, considerando ese contexto, que en términos organizacionales no existe una institucionalidad, una coordinación para poder, en el fondo, hablar de salarios, y por otro lado, bueno, lo que nos ha dejado la pandemia y la segmentación del mercado del trabajo, y cada vez tenemos más informalidad, tenemos más externalización, que también esas personas, dado el tipo de relaciones laborales colectivas, no están quizás cubiertas por acuerdos entre sindicatos y empleadores. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo, si tú tienes alguna experiencia, considerando ese contexto de tendencia a mayor informalidad, muy poca institucionalidad para poder tener este como diálogo entre niveles que hablabas tú, cómo tratar de promover ese diálogo social y crecimiento inclusivo con esta quizás condición un poco precaria de nuestra foto de relaciones colectivas y sindicalismo en Chile?
Bien, muchas gracias, Sebastián. Demian, muchas preguntas, porque la presentación también era un panorama conceptual y después, claro, y después ir aterrizando en los modelos o en las discusiones más estilizadas que tienen países como el Reino Unido, como Alemania, y después algunas preguntas para invitar a la discusión. Entonces creo que ha sido parte de todas las preguntas. Bueno, unos minutos para, obviamente, no hacer un recorrido exhaustivo todo, pero algunas reflexiones.
Sí. Bueno, Sebastián, estamos investigando un poco la ciudad que conoces mucho de Manchester, porque sí, también empezamos en Gran Bretaña en el mismo problema, ¿no? Siempre la densidad de enterprise es mucho menos que densidad general, ¿no? Porque son los grandes que tienen socios de sindicatos. Pero at a city level, nivel ciudad, hay cosas interesantes que pasan, ¿no? It's like there seems to be more potential for dialogue where there's a very strong kind of shared local cultural interest in the success and resilience and cohesion of a city. So maybe it's something about cities, and maybe you work on pockets and add to the patchwork, no? So rather than seeing the patchwork constantly being perforated, you build, and there is some interest now in this kind of, I suppose it's a little bit like the local living wage ordinances in the US, where there's a lot of excitement, but it's worth, it's kind of positive, it's interesting. And these build new forms of institutions. The other place we see them are in things like public procurement, where governments at local level can say, please procure from a unionized enterprise or one that respects labor market rules. Also in global value chains, you can say to suppliers, we're only going to put you in touch with the global source, the hub firm, if you respect these social dialogue mechanisms. I realize that it's usually the opposite trend. They're in, enterprise zones or, free trade zones or what do they call them in Britain? These new things. Oh, I've forgotten. But anyway, some other silly idea where you don't have to have the rules in order to contract with global hub firms. But yes, I agree with you that it's central for global value chains to think about minimum wages. I mean, there's a couple of countries in the world that only have minimum wage for textile industries because of the importance of foreign direct investment and trade rather than foreign direct investment. So I agree with you, that's very important. I think trade unions, yes, are very, very interested in whatever form of bipartite, tripartite policymaking, especially minimum wages, in countries where they don't have much of a voice at national level. So often in minimum wage policymaking, it's the only institutional or labor market policy where trade unions, can get in the newspapers and say, this is what we think. On all the other measures, they don't exist. And that's true in Britain. It's true in many developing countries where collective bargaining doesn't have a strong foothold. But so it's important to think of minimum wage machinery as an important social dialogue institution, because that's where we learn lessons, and that's what shapes a culture of social dialogue in a country. So if the minimum wage policy is successful, as it is in Britain, it means that tripartite policymaking is successful, right? One means the other. So I'm always saying that in Britain, that why not bring why not make another tripartite institution? Because the minimum wage has been so successful, right? Why not do it for training? Why not do it for working time? Why not do it for, getting rid of 0-hours contracts? So I think that's really important, and we don't pay enough attention to that. The minimum wage for many people can be a maximum. Yeah, and this is one of the big issues. And so in Britain also we see the discussion now is why are so many people not paid the minimum wage? Right. There's a big discussion about care workers because they only get paid when they go to a house. They drive to a house, they work for 15 minutes, they get a minimum wage for that. But then when they drive to the next house, they don't get paid. And you ask the tax office and you say, well, they're breaking the law. And they say, well, what can we do? But it's really a mess. And so I agree this is a problem. So perhaps I was presenting the best case where the minimum wage is a floor against exploitation. But of course, for many people, it's, especially if you're in the informal economy or it's a casual work, minimum wage is an important benchmark. I recognize it. Yeah. Which is why it's got to be set at a decent level, because we can't deny the fact that so many people are aspiring to earn a minimum wage. I think that's important. Yeah, so sorry if I flipped the way I presented that. I agree with what you've said there. The different connections with collective bargaining you might want to hypothesize. So with Gerhard Bosch, we wrote something about, and Jill Ruby, we wrote about close interactions, which is kind of France, where minimum wage and collective bargaining, they're always like this. And the Labour Ministry is always talking to the social partners saying, you've got to revitalize your wage floor in your agreement because we're overtaking with our minimum wage. And especially now with its quarterly changes. It's more distant, or it was more distant in Germany, but of course now Germany is very close also. So Germany can learn a lot from France. Maybe that's not usual, but I think they can now. And Britain, we usually call it an isolated form, which I think is true here. So here I would call the minimum wage policy isolated from collective bargaining. So then you have it's quite a different relationship. You wouldn't expect such an interaction. I mean, in Britain, there are some important enterprise bargains, like with leading supermarkets, but they don't have any interaction with minimum wage policy at all, as far as I know. So yes, so different relationships, I think. Roxana, sorry, I left you to last, which is unfair because she's got to talk now, right? You talked about the role of collective bargaining in shaping the relationship of precarious work, rotación laboral, productivity. So this is a question really, I think, about the strategy of employers and trade unions in forging collective agreements. Too often, maybe there's a focus from the trade union side on wages and from the employer side on productivity. I was always saying to ACTRAV in La OIT in Geneva, you've got to work on productivity. And to the employers, I was always saying, you've got to think more about pay equity. Because we have to think about inclusive growth in this sort of fashion. Because precarious work is bad for pay equity and it's bad for productivity. So I don't see how either side could argue for precarious work. So this idea, it's okay if you've got a profession and you're self-employed and you're freelancing and you're moving, that kind of rotación laboral, buenísimo. But if you haven't got a career, you haven't got a profession, you haven't got an occupational accreditation of any sort, it's precarious, it's not good for mutual investment in skills. And it's also not good for the economy in the way that they're developing digitalization. So we're doing some separate work now on different consequences of digital investment in companies, and where there's precarious work, limited investment, they'll do the more controlling type of digital applications rather than enhancing, a knowledge enhancing application. So it has lots of spillover effects, I think, for skill and digital technologies. I think, yes, I mean, I agree with minimum wage policy and collective agreements and how you do this in a high inflation economy. I mean, I leave that to you, to Roxana to explain. I wanted to talk to you. We had one coffee together. I want to have another to understand exactly how employers and unions can be constantly renegotiating every month, with 10% inflation a month in Argentina at the moment. If they can do that, even with a degree of success, it speaks to some really incredible institutional resources in Argentina at the moment. But it'd be useful to understand that better. Thanks very much for the questions. Really appreciate it.
Muchas gracias, Damien. Bueno, con estos comentarios vamos a cerrar